This video is sponsored by Factor. Have you ever flipped a laminate piece of furniture before? This little all laminate 6-drawer dresser caught my eye while I was out thrifting the other day. It's pretty outdated aesthetically speaking, but it's in really great condition functionally, so I thought that this and its matching nightstand would make a great flip. If you've been here with me for any amount of time, then you already know that these low-end laminate pieces are a favorite of mine. They're really often passed over by other flippers and refinishers because they're built with a lot of MDF and particle board, which is also the reason they're the first pieces to end up getting tossed in the trash when their design isn't in style anymore or they get damaged. There's sort of a general feeling that they're just not worth fixing, which is probably why I feel the need to rescue them. I don't know. I can't help but root for the underdog sometimes. I mean, it's still perfectly useful furniture that's probably got another generation or two in it if it's taken care of. Anyway, these have hardboard panels over the bodies with this wood grain kind of papery sticker over top, and the drawer fronts are all particle board with the same effect. I pulled out all the drawers and quickly figured out that this beautiful vintage peel and stick was stuck down good. So I used my heat gun, which is probably the same age as this furniture, and warmed up the adhesive to make it a bit easier to peel out. I know I'm going to catch some hate for ditching this hardware, but these aren't going to work with the more contemporary design I'm going to be giving these. So I put them all in a Ziploc and I'll redonate them the next time I'm out. I also checked to make sure that all of these drawer guides were secure and in good shape. These often come loose or get cracked over the years and need replacing, but this time they're all good to go. I did notice that this one drawer fell out, and that's because the nylon glide that holds it onto that wooden track is broken, which is also pretty common on these, but super easy to swap it for a new one. Okay, all I could see when I looked at these panels on the drawers were dog bones, and they need to go. I used my painter's tool and hammer just to get up underneath them and carefully pry them off the pin nails that were holding them in place. And then I used my side cutters to pull out any pins that were left behind. Once I had all those extra bits out of my way, it was time to clean. I always clean my furniture before I start any sanding so that I know I've removed any dirt, grease, or oils, and I'm not going to be grinding any of that down into the surface where it can cause issues with new finishes adhering properly. I like to use Simple Green, but any cleaner with a degreaser in it will do. Crud Cutter, TSP, Dawn dish soap will all work. I decided to pull the backer boards off here so I'd have some room for clamps in a few minutes. And since this bottom panel was already halfway off, I helped it the rest of the way too. The top had come away from the frame on this front corner, and it looked like maybe the screw that was holding it in had just come loose. But after I tried to tighten that, I realized that the hole was stripped. So I flipped the dresser upside down, drilled a new hole just beside the original one, and placed a fresh screw in there. Onto these bases, or skirting boards, I guess. Since I'm going for a more modern look, the wavy bits also need to go. I decided to use the curves that were already on each end as a starting point and then mark a straight line across the top of the waves just to streamline things. I popped a fresh blade onto my jigsaw and used its plate to figure out where I needed to clamp my ruler to use as a guide for the saw to help me make a really perfect line. Once I had everything lined up, I started cutting and quickly realized that the fine cut blade that I had was going to take forever to get all the way down this maple. So I switched out the jigsaw for my circular saw instead. I did need to take a couple of minutes to readjust my ruler guide for the different plate on here, but it cut this way better for me. I did basically the same thing for the nightstand, except it was smaller, so I couldn't use the circular saw or really clamp up my guide. So I ended up going back to the jigsaw and just freestyling this cut, trying to stay on the line that I'd marked off. Different tools, different tactics, but the same end result. The tops of these are also getting modified. I did this on another recent flip and loved how it turned out, but I wanted to remove all of the overhang around the tops and give these a really clean, squared off look. I put some more painter's tape down and measured out how much material needed to come off of each side, marked a line, and then double and triple checked that it was straight and square. I clamped up my ruler again to help with keeping the first few cuts straight, but when I got to the front edges, I just went super slow and stuck to the lines that I'd marked out as best I could. Since the skirting boards are the only solid wood part of these, I wanted to strip off the original wood grain stickers that were on here and restain them. And I thought that that would be way easier to do if they were off of the frames. So after taking a quick look at how they were attached, I just used a hammer again to knock them off of the pin nails that were holding them onto their support blocks. Once I've got everything finished, I'll just reattach those in the same way with some fresh nails. Oh boy, that was not part of the plan. Okay, so that was holding the shelf up. Good to know. I've been getting a ton of comments on Facebook and Instagram lately about not being able to afford the fancy surf prep sanders that I use. So I wanted to go back to basics here and use my regular old Ryobi, which is what I used for years before I saved up enough to be able to afford my surf preps. You don't have to invest in all the top of the line tools to do this job, especially right off the bat. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely adore my surf prep sanders, but they're not necessary to get good results. I wanted to give these drawers a quick once over with some 120 grit to smooth out all the little raised spots of particle board where I pulled the pin nails through so I could get those all filled in and flush. To do all my filling, I'm using Bondo. And yes, it is the same heavy duty filler that they use for bodywork on cars. It's also great for bodywork on furniture. It's a two-part product, so you have to mix the base putty in the can with this separate tube of blue cream hardening agent to get it to solidify. It does start to cure up really fast after it's mixed though, so I make sure to only make small batches, otherwise it's gonna turn solid before I can get it where I need it to be. I put a little piece of painter's tape on the inside of the hardware holes too, so that I could push the Bondo all the way through and not have it fall out the other side, and got all these blemishes covered too. Once I had the drawers done, I moved over to fill in the seams around the tops so that I could get a nice smooth finish on these corners without all the different textures and joints showing. Okay, it's 1 o'clock and the grumblies in my tumbly are telling me it is time for lunch. On days like today where I am absolutely grinding out in the garage, I have been loving having some delicious, fresh, never frozen, ready to go meals in the fridge from Factor. They're chef crafted, dietitian approved, and ready to eat in just 2 minutes, which sets me up for success and takes all the stress out of keeping myself fueled for the day. When I order, I can choose from a weekly menu of 35 items that include options like calorie-wise, keto, protein plus, or even veggie and vegan. They also now have a ton of snack options like breakfast, smoothies, and small bites, so I'm covered no matter what's on the schedule. One of my favorite features is actually how flexible Factor is. I can change my order with plans from 4 to 18 meals per week, pause or reschedule delivery anytime. It also helps me skip all the prep and cleanup of cooking because I've got enough prep and cleanup happening in the garage already. If you want to try out what Factor has to offer, you can head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code KatieScott50 to save 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next month of orders. That's code KatieScott50 at factor75.com for 50% off your first Factor box plus 20% off your next month of orders. Now that the Bondo was fully cured, I carefully started getting all the patches smoothed down with the same 120 grit. And I say carefully because these are particle board, which is really soft, and they only have that papery laminate finish on them. So if I were to sand with too coarse of a grit or too aggressively, I'd chew right through the material and end up making a giant mess that would probably be impossible to recover from. With all the patchwork smoothed out, I continued scuff sanding all the rest of the surfaces to give my primer some good micro texture to really grab onto this smooth surface, and then cleaned off as much of the dust as I could with a dry microfiber cloth. Primer is such a huge step with most furniture flips, but especially when you're working with these types of materials. Both MDF or hardboard and particle board love to absorb moisture and puff up or swell. I use this bin shellac based primer on most of my pieces because it covers all the bases regardless of the substrate I'm working on. But for these pieces specifically, it's not water-based, so it's gonna seal up all of this porous stuff and create a nice, hard, kind of candy coating over everything so it doesn't absorb the moisture from the paint, and it'll be more durable and resistant to humidity and moisture in its new home. It's kind of a pain to clean up though, so I like to line a tray with tin foil and just use a cheap dollar store roller to apply it. It can be sprayed, but make sure you follow all the instructions on the can, and also make sure that it's safe to do so in the sprayer that you've got because this stuff is highly flammable. This bright white also acts as a highlighter and will find you all the tiny imperfections that you can't see or feel without it. So for all the fine little blemishes, I use this glazing and spot putty, also made by Bondo, but very different stuff than the body filler. This is soft and is made to sit in really shallow spots and smooth them out. The primer and the spot putty both dry really fast, so I rolled on a second layer of primer over everything to build up my candy coating a bit more and called it a day. I gave the primer a quick smooth out with a fine grit pad to get rid of any orange peel texture from the roller or little fluffy bits that had landed in it. Wiped off the dust again with a damp microfiber rag this time, since now everything is encapsulated, and got myself set up to spray some paint on these guys. I wrapped all the drawers in some masking paper, and I've tried the painting with the drawers in or just blocking overspray with a piece of cardboard methods. And I always find them just as messy and time consuming with touching stuff up on the back end as it is to mask them off in the beginning. So I think I'm just gonna keep doing this because it works for me. And as I wrapped each drawer, I did find a few more little spots that could use a little bit more filler, so I touched those up as well. I decided to go with my Wagner Flexio electric sprayer for this project with some Sherwin-Williams Emerald urethane enamel in the color in the navy. This is a dark navy, so don't get too attached to this cobalt looking hue. It dries much darker than this. In the grand scheme of things, I really haven't used this sprayer a ton, and I definitely want to get better with it because it's very different from the pneumatic gun that I taught myself how to spray with. And it's usually a more affordable and approachable option for beginners who watch my channel. Regardless of what you're spraying with though, you always need to filter your paint. So I poured some through this paper filter and assembled the nozzle, which is super easy. I added about 2 tablespoons of water to this, even though the can says it doesn't need to be thinned, because this sprayer doesn't do the greatest with thicker materials. And once I had the paint to about the consistency of heavy cream, I twisted the turbine onto the nozzle, plugged it in, and tested out the settings on some cardboard. The knob behind the trigger adjusts the amount of material coming through the tip, and then there's also a boost dial on the top, which gives the motor a little more oomph if you need it. I landed with the flow dial about halfway open and the boost on level 6. I sprayed on this first coat and was really disappointed with the coverage. For a dark blue, it was super transparent and not what I'd expect, but I tried to trust the process and hoped it got a bit more opaque as it dried and darkened. This paint has a 4-hour recoat time, so I left my sprayer loaded up on the workbench while I waited. And when I came back to it, I just picked off the little paint booger that had dried over the tip, made sure the paint was flowing well on my cardboard again, and went right into the second coat. And again, I could still see way more primer and filler through the paint than I wanted to. I've used a lot of navy paints over the years, and I'd expect the second coat to be full coverage, but it was pretty clear pretty fast that this was going to need at least 3 coats to get a nice saturated color. Another 4 hours of dry time, and this is what I was looking at. To be fair, my overlap pattern is terrible, but I was putting on the same amount of paint that I usually do, and this color is just see-through. I gave this layer a smooth out again to get any fluffs or dust that had landed on it and sprayed on a third coat. This is what that third coat looked like dry. Still not fully covered. And at this point, I was so frustrated that it was taking so much time. I mean, 4 hours in between each coat times obviously at least 4 coats. Anyway, I sanded and dusted again and decided to switch over to my pneumatic gun for hopefully the last coat. This sprayer atomizes the paint a lot finer than the Wagner, so I thought that maybe I could spray on more color and not have it get splattery or drippy like I felt the Wagner would do if I increased its flow. I don't know if any of that is true, but it's what made sense in my head in the moment. The fourth coat finally did the trick, which was good because I was starting to worry that I was going to run out of paint. Usually for a project this size, I'd use a little less than half a quart, and I'd almost gone through the whole can. Okay, moving on. I stapled these backer boards back on, and with all of my paint problems, I'd totally forgotten about the skirting boards. So once all the paint was dry, I nailed in some of these glides onto the bottom, just so that the furniture's raised up off the floor a bit, and it should help protect the bottom edges from getting damaged just by being dragged around on the floor or accidentally sitting in mop water or spilled drink. And then I got the sander back out and removed this faux wood grain with some 120 grit and then 180 grit to smooth out the wood. I wanted to keep the wood grain dark and rich, but with the actual wood grain instead of the wood grain sticker. So I grabbed this water-based wood stain from Salmon in the color dark walnut. I wiped it on in the direction of the grain with a little staining sponge and then wiped back any excess with a shop towel. This stuff tends to look pretty opaque when you apply it and then kind of chalky when it dries. But as soon as you add a top coat or sealer to it, the wood comes right back to life. This hemp oil is going to condition and seal the wood. So once the stain was fully dry, I just spread a generous amount over each board and left it to soak down into the pores for about 30 minutes. Then I wiped off any excess oil that hadn't absorbed and buffed it a bit with another shop towel. I pulled all the old pin nails out of their mounting blocks on the bases and then flipped both pieces upside down again so I could re-nail the trim. Once I got everything carried inside, I was ready to install the new handles. This hardware jig makes figuring out where to drill new holes so easy. So if you do this often, I would highly suggest picking one of these up. I set the width of the handles just by screwing them right into the jig. And once those pieces were locked in, I lined up where I wanted them to sit height-wise on the drawer. Then I marked out the center point on each drawer just on another piece of painter's tape, lined up the jig with that line, and then marked where I needed to drill with a pencil. Okay, here's our look back at the furniture pieces that we started off with. Tired and outdated, but still sturdy and sound. And here is where we've ended up. Modern and masculine. I think these are going to look great in a little boy's bedroom somewhere. It's not going to be a flip that anyone's going to retire on. They won't ever be massive money makers. But if you do it right, you should still be able to turn a profit on this sort of stuff. That's only my opinion, though. I'd love to hear your perspective and thoughts on this type of furniture too. So make sure to leave me a comment and let me know what you think. Thank you so much for watching along with this project, and I will catch you all next time.